1 in 3 is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own. Hi, warriors. Welcome to 1 in 3. I'm your host, Ingrid. And today I'm joined by one of my favorite people, my sister, Jessica. While I love having her on the show, today's topic is a tough one, but an incredibly important one: suicide. Jessica is a licensed clinical social worker with extensive knowledge and experience in this field, and she's here to share her insights on the connection between domestic violence and suicide. Before we dive in, I do want to apologize for my grovelly voice. My allergies are really acting up lately. Thanks for bearing with me. Hello, little sister, also known as Jessica. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Ingrid. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you so much for coming on my podcast. I've been wanting to have a professional, and you actually happen to be a professional right at my fingertips. So that's very kind of you to take your time to join me today.
You're welcome. I didn't know I had a choice.
You didn't, but I still am going to be gracious and say thank you. So today we're going to talk about suicide and its links to domestic violence / intimate partner violence. So before we get started, I'd like for you, please, to give just a bit of a background on your experience with suicide.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Florida and Texas. I have had my LCSW for 14 years, I think. Roughly, maybe. And in the majority of my experience with suicide has been with active duty military and veterans. And it's probably about a total of almost 7 years of working with suicidality. And so I would like to say I'm a subject matter expert on that.
It's weird for my little sister to be a subject matter expert on anything, but I would I'd have to agree with that. So just could you explain what an LCSW is and what those qualifications are, just so everyone knows?
Sure. It's a licensed clinical social worker. You have to have a master's degree in social work. And then depending on the state requirements, you either have to have 2 years or 3 years of clinical supervision, and you have to pass a national exam to be able to be a licensed clinical social worker, which means you can provide therapy, you can diagnose pretty much everything that a psychologist can do except for some psychological testing.
Okay. So definitely very qualified.
Thank you.
All right. So let's start talking about suicide and domestic violence.
I was able to obtain some statistics for you, and one of them, the number you will find interesting, 1 in 3 women who have attempted suicide in the past year, and this is from 2021, was a recent IPV victim.
That's insane.
That is.
That's a crazy statistic. Quickly, IPV. I know I've talked about it before, but since we're using abbreviations, I like to update just in case this is somebody's first time listening to this this podcast.
IPV, intimate partner violence, is what that stands for. And I also have the links to all the resources if you need them, or if anyone wants them.
That's perfect. I'll put those in the show notes for sure.
References, not resources. I also do have resources. So
quick, it doesn't say, that article didn't say like how recent, did it? Because I guess
the article was written in 2022. So I believe the stats were taken from 2021 and 2020.
But it says the 1 in 3 is that they were a recent victim. It doesn't say like how recent.
Oh, I see. No, right? It doesn't.
Because I guess technically they can be at risk for forever, really, right?
That's actually what I do have some of the risk factors for suicide coincide a lot with victims of IPV, some of the risk factors, a history of mental health, substance use, impulsivity, hopelessness, isolation, access to lethal means, psychosocial stressors, which could be financial, housing, anything to
An abusive partner.
Well, yes, I'm getting to that. That's in a little bit. Employment, legal, and then relationship stressors, which is a very nice way to say part of an abusive partner. Toxic relationships, no relationship with family.
Yeah, so that covers every aspect of domestic violence. So the legal, the financial, the psychological, emotional. Does it say, did you say physical?
I did not say physical.
Okay. Well, I'm sure this is going to play into it too.
But I mean, the victimization, it's associated with anxiety, depression, PTSD, fear, concern of safety, physical injury, which you did mention, and some of the risk factors for experiencing IPV, either as a victim or a perpetrator, because I wanted to talk about suicide and perpetrators as well, includes substance abuse, alcohol dependence, the social isolation, history of abuse, whether it be as a victim or a witness of parental IPV. And they also, all those correlate with suicide as well. So there's a lot of risk factors.
And it makes sense because as a victim of domestic violence, you're stuck in this situation where you feel alone. So the isolation and
Hopelessness.
There's hopelessness. And I mean, you may feel alone, but then you also could actually be alone because one of the things that perpetrators or abusers do is attempt to isolate you, either physically or all those other things you listed, financially, socially, whatever. So it makes sense that you begin to think that there is no other alternative to escape from your reality other than consideration of suicide.
Exactly. There was also, so I know that sometimes when you kind of think of suicide and IPV, you think of murder-suicide. And that is actually pretty rare. It's less than 2% of the suicides from the available research I found. And so a lot of the research that has been done has been focusing on the murder-suicide aspect of it. So unfortunately, there's the data out there. This is the most recent data that I found that is out there, but more studies are being conducted. And there was also actually in the UK, there was a police force, the National Police Chiefs Council, and they're doing a study on suicide and domestic violence to better train their police officers when they respond to a situation. And they listed an analysis which came out last year on March 13th. And the key findings from the report, I found this pretty interesting. There's a total of 242 domestic abuse related deaths were recorded between April 22nd to March 23rd. There was 93 suspected victim suicides following domestic abuse, 80 intimate partner homicides, 31 adult family homicides, 23 unexpected deaths, which they did not clarify what that meant. This part's a little sad. 11 child deaths and 4 quote unquote other deaths, which are individuals that live with the family but were not family members, like a friend being at the home. Which recently in Central Texas, there was a murder-suicide of a spouse and her friend in the home.
I actually know the statistic. I think it's about 20% of intimate partner violence homicides actually involve other individuals outside of the victim, like family members, neighbors, people who intervene, law enforcement officers, or even bystanders.
Bad. There was some other data that I got from this report that I also found interesting, if you don't mind if I share. Okay.
Please do. That's why you're here.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So the majority of the victims were female between 25 and 54, and the majority of the perpetrators were male and of the same 25 to 54. The number of victims and perpetrators of ethnic minority remains slightly higher than overrepresented than the general population. 4 in the 5 perpetrators were known to the police before the homicide occurred. 3 and 5 were for domestic abuse, and over a third were known to other agencies, not just the police.
So quickly, when they're saying the perpetrator, are they saying that that's the person who committed the homicide, or that's the person who committed suicide or who killed themselves?
Homicide.
Okay. Yeah, that's a huge link. That is super frustrating for me, is these individuals who have a previous history, especially in domestic violence and aggressive domestic violence, to be released many times without letting the victim know that they've been released. And they're released prematurely, I think.
Yes. And another thing is that the majority of the method of suicide was firearm, which we do know the danger of having a firearm, especially in a domestic violence situation, for the risk of death, and then also now for the risk of suicide.
Yeah, so risk of death, it increases by 500%.
It's insane.
Which is insane.
Some states have laws that if you have a domestic violence charge on you, you're not supposed to own a firearm.
And that's where it comes in on, is there a domestic violence charge? Because my abuser, for instance, owns firearms, and I have never filed a report on him.
To coincide with that, there's also supposed to be a limitation with mental health diagnoses and owning a firearm. And when you fill out, I don't know if you remember when you filled out your concealed permit, it asks if you've ever been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. And so it's self-report. So that is kind of a flaw in the system. I'm not saying everyone's mental health record should be free for all to look at, but it's just a flaw. I don't have a solution. It's just a flaw.
I agree. And we aren't we're not saying take the guns away. We're not saying pro guns or anything. We're just saying that there are these links to what can happen. So I'm not familiar with the gun laws in the United Kingdom. Is that, did it mention anywhere use of guns with those statistics?
No,
Okay.
it didn't. Let's see. 10% of suspects were either currently or previously had been managed by police or on probation. Some of the risk factors, controlling and coercive behavior, mental health, alcohol use, drug use. Those are some of the things that they found, which also are risk factors for suicide. So another statistic I found, intimate partner violence was a precipitating factor for 4.5% of single suicide events. So this doesn't say whether they were the victim or the perpetrator. And when you combine that with homicide suicide data, it is suggested, because like I said, the data is incomplete because there's not enough research out there, that IPV is a precursor for 6.1% of suicides overall, which is, it sounds like a small number, but I feel like that is a very, very large number.
Well, and you are the expert.
Well, and to compare, chronic pain is 8.8%. Job problems of psychosocial employment, 6.4%. So it is third on the list of reasons, or not reasons, precipitating events for suicide.
So is chronic pain the number one risk factor?
I think it's kind of hard to determine, especially you have to go back and look and review, kind of do a behavioral health autopsy on someone's medical history and mental health history to kind of determine what the cause was. So if chronic pain is listed in their medical records, you can say that chronic pain was a precipitating factor.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, one thing too, which I sort of alluded to earlier, is the longevity of how someone is determined as far as being an IPV victim, is the longevity of their risk factor for suicide, is because, for instance, chronic pain could be something that they could be 10 years out from their abusive relationship, but still be suffering from chronic pain that they got as a result of being physically abused by their partner. So I guess it would be kind of difficult maybe. Again, if it's in somebody who hasn't reported the IPV too,
exactly. And so the mental health, you cannot, if no one is aware of the IPV happening, they just say mental health is the precipitating factor. So it's like I said, the data it needs to be researched a lot more so we can try to get to the cause and put resources and suicide prevention resources again out there.
So in other words, again, statistics are terrible, but they're way worse than what we understand it to be. Like, for instance, the 1 in 3 women, 1 in 3 men who are victims of physical violence or sexual violence by their partners, those numbers are actually way worse because the violence is underreported. And so then that also coincides with the suicide because those numbers are underreported.
And I mean, suicide's a top 10 of a leading cause of death in the United States. They've increased in the last 2 decades. This is from 1999 to 2019. And it was a 30% increase over those last. The suicide rates have climbed most sharply for women and Black non-Hispanic youth.
And that data ends at 2019?
Yes.
Okay. So it's probably way worse considering that's COVID was just around the corner from that.
Yeah. Actually, I'm so glad you said that because there was a study in Oregon that discussed the effects of COVID and domestic violence and suicidality. Like it's one of the resources that I'm going to share for you to put in your show notes. And they actually came out with a whole entire report and options for people because of COVID. And they were aware that domestic violence and suicide rates were going up because of it.
And I can't imagine because being in a domestic violence situation where you or your partner is able to go to work every day, or both of you is able to go to work and escape from being in the same physical environment 24 hours, 7 days a week, and then COVID shuts that down. So already before you're getting some sort of reprieve, and suicide might be something that you have been considering, and now you're just inundated in this abuse. I could and nowhere to go. And then you can't even if you were getting therapy, how are you supposed to get therapy with your abuser in the house?
Exactly.
So yeah, I imagine those numbers are insanely elevated.
So in regards to the adult section of suicide, survivors of IPV are twice as likely to attempt suicide multiple times than the general population. And
that's survivors, like people who are out of the relationship. Or
I didn't read the specifications.
Well, and that's fine because I think the definition of victim and survivor varies from individual. So like I personally feel a victim is in the relationship and may consider the understanding of what's happening, but is still excusing it. Like for myself, I was a victim for quite a while. And then I feel that you become a survivor not when you physically get out, but when you realize this is happening to me, I need to get out because now you're in survivor mode. I'm going to do this. So I mean, it varies because some other individuals will consider a survivor as somebody who is physically removed from the abuse. So back to like the attempting suicide portion. I don't know if you have anything to talk about with this, but there may be attempts as, and I'm not sure if this is the correct terminology to use. I know that with suicide, things have changed a little bit as far as what you are supposed to say and what you're not supposed to say. But attempting suicide could be an actual cry for help, not completing suicide. And it may not just be I'm really sad and depressed. It may be like, hey, somebody pay attention to me. I'm being abused and I have no idea how else to say something about it or bring attention to this.
It could be suicide attempts. Again, it's unfortunately the definitions of attempts are also subjective based on the level of training and experience of the person reporting it, the medical or mental health professional. A lot of times self-harm and suicide have been interjected like for each other, and it's not correct. Self-harm is like cutting, where you just like try to physically harm yourself, not in a way to actually end your own life. And suicide attempts can also vary from, there's a thing called preparatory behavior. Preparatory behavior is where you say like you stockpile all of your medications with the thoughts of, I'm going to overdose on them later. But you're not physically doing that right now. That's preparatory behavior, which is also very, very concerning because people are at risk for it's generally 90 days after someone does that or like goes to a store and buys a gun as preparatory behavior. They're most at risk for 90 days following that preparatory behavior. A suicide attempt could also be putting a gun into your mouth, but not pulling the trigger. Or it could also be putting a gun into your mouth, pulling the trigger, knowing a bullet's not in there, or putting a gun in your mouth, pulling the trigger, knowing a bullet's in there, and the gun doesn't fire. So those are all my definitions of suicide attempts. But again, it's subjective on the mental health and medical professional as to what they say it is.
That makes sense, which makes this whole suicide and domestic violence suck, obviously, but it makes it so much more difficult to identify all the specifics in order to be able to treat all the specifics, because there is such a differentiation in subjective data.
One of the biggest things that if you know someone who's experiencing suicidal ideations or, you know, thoughts of suicide, even thoughts of wishing that they were dead, not necessarily suicidal thoughts, but just thoughts of, I wish I was dead. There are some mitigating factors that you could do. One of the big things is lethal means safety. It is trying to put some kind of barrier between that person and whatever method they want to follow through with on suicide. So gun locks, giving someone, a family member access, giving them your firearm for the meantime. I know in domestic violence situations that may not always be possible, especially if you're isolated. You could always put the bullets in a different spot and put the firearm in a different spot. So it takes several steps for that person to actually go get the bullets, put them in the gun. And during that duration of time, hopefully some kind of intervention can be put in place, whether it be them calling someone, calling a friend, or them just changing their thought process as well. And same thing with medications. There's a lot of ways that you can dispose of extra medications around the house. If you're having thoughts of suicide and you want to overdose, you can ask your provider, can I only get a week supply at a time instead of a 30 or 90-day supply? And another part of the mitigating things to do is to involve family and friends. That's not always possible in this situation. So it is there's a phone number. There's a crisis line phone number that is the best to use. I know there's a domestic violence hotline. There's also the 988 crisis line, which you can call. You can be anonymous. You don't have to provide your name. The only reason that they will get access to your information is if they think that you're at imminent risk of hurting yourself.
Well, I suppose one of the concerns with a domestic violence victim in getting other people involved is, there's always so many issues with that, because again, you may not be acknowledging that what you're having is abuse. So I've said before, for instance, I didn't want to let you know everything that was going on because I didn't want you to judge my partner, because how could we go to, how could we hang out together with you knowing everything about him? So that might be something that holds a victim back from getting family or friends involved. There's also the concern of you don't want someone to intervene. So you may confide in a colleague. Well, what happens if that colleague is very ambitious and decides to contact law enforcement for a well check or something along those lines, and the abuser's home? And so law enforcement comes for a well check on you, not for a domestic violence disturbance, but now that has keyed your abuser into the idea of who are you talking to and what are you saying?
Which puts you at risk. And another, not even the physical abuse, like the emotional abuse of intimate partner violence, this person will get beat down and think that everything that they're saying is true and may not want to reach out because they've been beat down so much and think no one else cares. This is what.
Absolutely. That you're lucky to have me. You're nothing without me. Nobody else is going to care about you. That's all part of the isolation tactics too, right? Is, I'm going to make your sister doesn't care about you. If she really cared about you, she'd be here. And you start to believe it. And so how am I'm not going to talk to my sister about it. I believe now my sister doesn't care about me. And so,
Which is never, ever going to be true.
Well, I know that. I'm giving it as an example. I probably did believe it for a little bit, though. It crossed my mind every once in a while.
Oh, my goodness.
I do still believe that your mom and dad's favorite, but we won't get into that.
Well, that's a given. That is 100% a given.
Okay. So I'm going to interject here that if Jessica and I laugh a little bit, we actually, one, we're sisters and we have a good relationship. But two, we actually have a podcast that's been a separate podcast where we do goof around. So even on serious topics, we will try to laugh here and there. So we're not minimizing this topic. It's a super serious, both suicide and domestic violence are super serious relationships, but
and both of our passions, my passion and your passion combined.
Absolutely. It's the passions are colliding, and every once in a while we'll make light of something ridiculous.
It's our coping mechanism. Please forgive us.
And we're probably making light of ourselves. So not the actual topic. Okay. So back to you. I think this is about to get sucky.
This is. So I wanted also to look into the data on how children are impacted with suicide and domestic violence, intimate partner violence. I did not find any research in the United States. I didn't do a lot of deep digging on it because it's just a really crappy topic, and I don't. Yeah, sorry. So
again, your background is primarily adults.
It is primarily adults, yes. So I found an Australian report it was published in 2022. So I wanted something recent because actually there's not a lot out there. And psychosocial risk factors were the most common factors associated with suicide in Australia. So the, things going on interpersonally.
And did it give an age range, or that's just blanket?
That's just blanket.
Okay.
So then also international studies, which were, when I looked, there was a lot of Asian studies, like there was Bangladesh was in there. There was some Indian studies in there. It was fascinating, but I couldn't find any from the US. So the international studies have specifically identified child maltreatment and experiences of domestic family violence as significant contributing factors to avoidable deaths in early adulthood. This is just
so the abuse that they witnessed or experienced as a child is carrying over into their suicide risk as adults?
No, these are still children completing suicide. So Australia has decided to pay closer attention as to the leading causes and risk factors of children completing suicide because their rates have been higher. There's a recent national study of a little over 5,000 young Australians, and it revealed that 1 in 2 of young people in Australia grow up with some form of domestic family violence.
1 in 2.
1 in 2. So their definition of domestic family violence does include IPV and child mistreatment, child abuse.
Okay, but still, 1 in 2?
1 in 2.
Oh my God, that's awful.
So this part discusses the witnessing, and it says that although they're not exposed, that they may not be the intended target, this form of, they called it vicarious victimization, it can lead to similar outcomes as the person actually experiencing the abuse, the primary target and object of the abuse. So the experiences of domestic family violence, they call it DFV, during childhood have been identified as a risk factor for suicide attempts and also suicidal ideation, which is the thoughts of suicide, and the planning, which kind of goes back to the preparatory behaviors I was talking. So here's a crappy statistic, and this is the last of the data I have on this because, like I said, it just breaks my heart. A recent study, which was published in 2021, showed a significant association between experiences of domestic family violence and suicidal behaviors among individuals aged 10 to 20 years old. So it is a significant association. So children who experience or witness are more likely to have suicidal behaviors between 10 and 20.
And I understand that's not in the United States. I actually do have statistics for in the United States. It's not suicide.
Oh, okay.
It's not suicide related, but just domestic violence related. 1 out of 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence annually in the United States. 90% are eyewitnesses. So you take that statistic and align it with the statistics that you have. It's humongous. I'm not going to do the math, but it's horrible, horrible statistics. This isn't intimate partner violence, but just to report these findings as well, is 1 out of 5 female high school students and over 13% male high school students report physical or sexual abuse by their dating partner.
Oh my goodness.
So I'm sure that those factors also play into consideration of risk for suicide. Well, they definitely do, especially based on what you told us at the beginning of this episode, as far as risk factors for suicide. But these individuals, these high school students, if you're not going to consider that, I mean, it is domestic violence. It's intimate partner violence. It may not be domestic in terms of residing in the same household at that point, but these people are now at higher risk to end up in an actual cohabitation of domestic violence, whether it's an intimate partner or a roommate even.
Exactly. And another thing that goes along with the children is that the children see these relationships growing up and it becomes normalized for them. So when they do become adults, they tend to, I'm not going to say they tend to, but they can veer towards those kind of relationships because that's what's normal for them. And it brings up the same risk factors, the mental health, the hopelessness, the isolation, all of those same risk factors for suicide.
Well, in addition to that, they're at higher risk, children witnessing, not even experiencing the abuse themselves, but witnessing. There are higher rates for substance abuse and alcohol abuse as they, I mean, even probably as the teenage years and as they progress through life, they're at a higher risk for substance abuse, which then in turn increases the risk for suicide.
One of the things that I've noticed in my professional experience with suicide is I would say almost every single person that I've come across, hopelessness is always mentioned. Like they have no hope. They see no way out. And imagine a child witnessing domestic violence against one of their parents, like a parent on parent. Can you imagine how hopeless they feel?
Well, and so confused. And I've said this before, that as a child, your biggest role models are mom and dad. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's not even, I'm just going to say good guy, bad guy, just to simplify things. So even if one of the parents is the bad guy and, that person is abusing the other parent who's the good guy, the child is going to be so confused anyway, because these are his or her role models. They're heroes. And now you have bad guy abusing good guy, or even talking badly about the good guy. So now they start to doubt the good guy and they doubt their reality. And you're right. Then they say, okay, well, this is how dad treats mom or mom treats dad, and that's okay.
And also bring into the fact of second marriages or second partners. And when the parent that you thought was your, quote unquote, good parent brings in an abusive partner, and what message is that giving to the child? Absolutely.
Especially in domestic violence. Unfortunately, being a survivor of domestic violence, you are at a higher risk of becoming involved in another domestic violent relationship. Okay. Do you have more statistics?
I don't
Okay.
have any more statistics.
I think I might be okay with that.
Yeah, I'm actually okay with that too. Yes.
Okay. So just to wrap up and sort of consolidate, could you just sort of streamline your information? So I suppose risks one more time for suicide, and then warning signs, I think, would be a good one for people to be aware of.
Okay. So some of the risk factors, the mental health, substance use, impulsivity, hopelessness, isolation, access to the lethal means, whether it be a firearm, medications, a rope, a car, restricting access to the lethal means, the psychosocial stressors, and the legal stressors, and most importantly, especially in IPV, the relationship stressors. Those are some of the risk factors. Some of the signs and symptoms would be the preparatory behavior, the stockpiling of the medication, that seeking access to the lethal means, whether it be researching where to purchase a firearm, researching methods, whatever. It could be giving away items, lack of interest in things that they used to enjoy, the isolation. But when it comes to IPV, some of that isolation may not be in their option to control. Those are some of the risk factors that you can pay attention to. The risk, just because, are not risk factors. Some of those may be some of the signs, but also know that there may be zero signs of it. And someone preparing a will, that could be a sign, and it could just be someone being super, responsible. Oh, I thought you were going to say something. Okay.
I was going to say responsible for you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Another thing that I would say is, if you are a friend or family member and you notice some of these signs, or you notice something, or you just have this feeling, ask that person, are you having thoughts of suicide? Do not ask, are you thinking about harming yourself? Because again, that could be the self-harm, that could be the cutting, which is a maladaptive coping skill to help deal with things. So you need to ask specifically, are you having thoughts of suicide? And just because you ask someone that, it's not going to put the idea in their head. If they have the idea, it is already there. And if they say yes, it does not mean that they're going to do it in front of you. So you don't need to be scared of the answer. If someone does say, yes, I'm having thoughts of suicide, don't leave them alone. Just sit there, ask what's going on, or just be silent and let them talk. It's validate their feelings. Validate that, yes, that sounds very difficult. I see that you're thinking about suicide, and that can be really scary. That can be terrifying to have those thoughts. And then try to encourage to get them help. And some of the ways they can get help, one of the immediate ways is an emergency room. If you're ever having thoughts of suicide, you can always go to an emergency room. You'll get evaluated there. They won't always keep you. The only time they will is if they think you are at an imminent risk of hurting yourself, which means if you leave that hospital, you are going to go out and try to complete suicide. So that's the only way you stay. You can always voluntarily go inpatient if you want to. And if you voluntarily go, you get to voluntarily leave. So an emergency room is an option. Calling 911 is also an option. And then I mentioned it earlier, the crisis line. It is 988, just like 911 is 988. You can remain anonymous. If you're a veteran, you can dial 988 and then you press 1. And that way you get taken to the military and veterans crisis line instead of the general crisis line. But they can provide you resources. They can just be a person to listen to. And again, you can remain anonymous. The only way that they would try to find you is if you are, again, at risk of imminently hurting yourself. And then SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Sorry, I had a blank. They created a zero suicide toolkit for providers, community members, individuals. I'll send Ingrid the link so she can put it in her show notes. That's a pretty helpful toolkit and can also give you ideas or options of things that you can do for your family member, friend, community, whatever you feel like doing.
So you can just have that toolkit.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I know that healthcare providers and law enforcement individuals are trained on this, but for instance, what did they do if they find somebody who appears to be in immediate crisis so that, people can understand? I know you mentioned the ER and they're not going to hold you unless they feel that you're an imminent threat. But if somebody were considering suicide and seriously considering it at that moment and they decide to call law enforcement, what can they expect to happen?
It actually depends on where you are. So I've called welfare checks on people before when they had like how you said, they had the suicidal ideation, they had the intention, which means when you say intention, it means they want to follow through with it and they know that the consequences of their actions. They know that if they take all these pills that they will die. So if they have that intent and know the definition of that intent, so suicidal ideation intent means. So when I have called welfare checks, if it is a busier metroplex, the police will get there when they can. And it is very terrifying staying on the phone with someone who has suicidal ideation intent and means waiting for the police to show up, and it can take 45 minutes. However, if it's more local and they have a designated task force, a mental health task force, a crisis team, some places do, they can send them out and evaluate them. The police will show up, they'll talk to the individual, and although they are not mental health professionals, they will assess and they will base their assessment on what the person says. So say you call 911 on someone who has suicidal ideation intent and means, and when the police show up, they're like, no, I'm not planning on killing myself. I was just saying that. The police will not push it any further. However, if they continue talking to the individual and they feel that person is at risk and needs a further evaluation, you will get taken to your closest emergency room in a police car. Sometimes you are handcuffed for your safety. Sometimes you are not. It depends on the police department, honestly, and it varies. But you get taken to the closest emergency room. So even if you have an emergency room that you prefer, or a hospital you prefer, or another one, the police and the EMS will always take you to the closest one.
Once they get into the emergency department and the professionals determine that they are indeed an imminent risk to themselves, they admit and they decide that they cannot discharge them from their facility. If they have the capacity to hold that individual, first of all, if they don't have the capacity, is there a chance that they get transferred to somewhere else, or the facilities or the resources to properly treat them?
What do you mean if they don't have the capacity?
So for instance, say it's just like a small hospital, they don't have the room, nor they don't have somebody that could,
okay,
they don't have like a psych unit for this person, or they don't have enough staff to keep eyes on this person. I suppose there would be a potential for them to get transferred to another facility.
Absolutely. And most emergency rooms do have mental health rooms, whether it be one or two, and you would remain on a 1-to-1, which means a nurse or some staff at the hospital would sit with you the whole time. If you get brought in by the police department or EMS, they will, just so you know, they will take your belongings to include your cell phone. You can get your cell phone back to get a phone number if you need to call a family member or a friend. However, your belongings get taken from you, and they make sure that you're in it's a mental health room, so there's no risks of you completing suicide while you're in the actual room. If the medical professionals think that you need to be hospitalized and you do not want to be hospitalized, they will get a legal warrant. A detention warrant is what we call it here in Texas. You can get a detention or involuntary hold. That gets put in front of a judge, and it's a mandatory 72-hour hold. You cannot be discharged until the end of that 72 hours. So that's why I said if you go into a hospital voluntarily, you can still voluntarily leave if you do get hospitalized. So there's something to expect. But if you go into an emergency room on your own, say a friend, or you bring yourself in, most times you can still they'll put you on a 1-to-1, but most times you can still have access to your phone to be able to call. Or if you go in with a friend, I have known some emergency rooms to let the friend or family member stay in the room with you. One thing, I'm so sorry, I meant to bring this up earlier, is that there has been research that says that someone is suicidal from thoughts to actual action occurs in less than an hour. So that's why the lethal means is so important, to put time in between. So it can last from 5 minutes to an hour from thought to action. So if you know, or you yourself are experiencing it, that even that initial thought, if you have a safety plan, much like a domestic violence safety plan, of where you have someone you can call to distract them, some kind of music, movie, go for a walk, some kind of activity to get yourself out of that, a suicide safety plan is another good tool to have.
And that can be another example of where code words come into play. You know, if your abuser's in the home and you have a trusted confidant of where you feel like I have no other option right now, you can call them and give your code word so that person knows, okay, this is the 1 hour time frame I have right now. I have a question for you. So you said it could take up to 45 minutes, and, you know, possibly if it's just really crappy places, it could maybe even take more than 45 minutes. If you are someone who has been confided in this, say you call me and you say, I want to complete suicide. The firearm is sitting in my lap right now. I understand that this is it, and I'm not going to come back from that. And this is what I plan to do. What do you suggest that person on the other phone do? Like, you don't want them to hang up, right?
No, stay on the phone with them.
How do you get law enforcement and stay on the phone with them? How do you do all of that?
If in a professional setting, when I've had to do that, I have messaged coworkers of, please call 911 and do a welfare check on this. So if I was on my personal phone, I'd probably put that person on speaker and text someone and say, you need to call 911 and have them come to this address. And then that's another thing. You have to know where that person is.
Yeah. So, and then you just stay on the line until somebody gets there.
Yes.
Because the second you hang up, that could be
alone.
They're alone.
You never want to leave someone who's suicidal alone.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jessica.
You're welcome. I'm sorry, I talked longer than I thought I meant to.
This is what we do. Okay, this is what happens when our passions collide. Okay, so in summary, again, Jessica just went over the you did go over the risk factors earlier in this episode, but you did just summarize what are some clues that somebody may be considering suicide, and then you summarized what somebody should do. We talked about what could happen once help is activated. Is there anything else you can think of that we need to bring up?
Nothing I can think of.
So again, I thank you very, very much for taking the time out of your incredibly busy life to come on and talk. No, and I'm being serious.
Are you?
I am. You guys, Jessica works full time. Her husband works full time. She has 2 kids. We used to have, like I said, we used to have a podcast so that we kept updated. It's been on hold for a bit, but we're going to come back. But I do really appreciate you coming on here. I know this is your passion, but it still is a sucky topic, as is mine. So I really do appreciate it. I hope. And again, I will list those resources that Jessica mentioned in the show notes, as well as the crisis line, which is 988. Super easy, 988 for the crisis line.
Can I say thank you for having me on here? Suicide prevention is a huge passion of mine, and talking about it is one of the best ways to get the information out. Talking about suicide, making that person feel comfortable and normal to be able to talk to you about it is huge. I can't tell you how huge it is. Just having someone that they can confide in and get all their stuff out. So talk about it.
Once again, Jessica, thank you so much. The links to everything that she mentioned, as well as the crisis line, will be listed in the show notes. And I will be back next week with another episode for you. And until then, stay strong. And wherever you are in your journey, always remember, you are not alone. Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, IN, the number 3, podcast.com. Follow 1 in 3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1 in 3 podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1 in 3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.